So I have a couple of questions. First of all, you answered one, so that's good.
Yep.
And once we go into facility, just look at our needs. That being said, thank you for making the statement that we have about 3.4 billion in need out there, 1.8 billion in critical needs. So clearly, we're not funding all the critical needs given the budget that we have. So there's still a lot more to fund. The transparency of the process of which ones get funded and not needs to continue. So I applaud the process there was taken to date. And also, as we look at those, ensuring, I'll cite one example that we heard from today, right? So the speakers that we have from Kellogg School did an excellent job of putting together a PowerPoint, all of pictures depicting the needs. And I can't gauge what, how many of those are critical versus not. But there are probably 400 other schools in similar situations, right? So I also want to make sure that we don't overreact and ensure that we do take a step back in equity and look at all schools equally, right, across all districts, because they're not all here giving us their presentations with pictures. So that part of the process needs to continue, focusing clearly on the critical needs. Do we have a sense, given that we heard on another issue related to capital needs is ADA access, right? Do we have a sense of, similar to how you sized the 3.4 billion in deferred needs, if money wasn't an issue, what would it take to make all floors accessible?
Sure. So ultimately our assessments have to ensure first floor accessibility to every school around $80 million, and to make every school ADA accessible from top to bottom around $600 million. Once again, it's important to note that of the 263 in facility needs that we're going to do, as well as some of the programmatic investments, those areas will allow us to chip away at that ADA accessibility. And that's why, even though we have a 5-year goal to ensure minimum accessibility, meeting at minimal hitting that $80 million target, we feel both with the opportunities that we have in other capital areas, but also with a 5-year capital plan. And as investments like the pre-K, projects, go by the course, we will have the ability to invest more in deferred maintenance and ADA accessibility over the next few years.
And how many of our schools are already fully ADA accessible? Do we have
we can get that answer, but yes.
Can I just ask a related question on the ADA, because this came up today, but also at the Capitol hearings last week. I can imagine there could be different ways to approach it. So one is making the first floor accessible. Another could be making a smaller number of schools fully accessible, or targeting investments based on where we have students with demonstrated need, or communities that have, I guess, a greater or lesser need. How was the decision made, or can you explain a bit about the logic of making the goal first floor accessibility?
So I think there's a couple of pieces to it. I think one, we need to start somewhere, just kind of like, level setting. I think two, while there's not only issues in regards to student accessibility, we want to make sure that parents, community members can have access to the school. And if you're at least assuring first floor accessibility, you can then make accommodations to have report card meetings, things of that nature. With that being said, I think it's important to note that we have not allocated that $10.5 million yet to projects. Okay. We want to work with stakeholders. Access Living is someone who's been deeply involved in CPS. They're an organization that, we read their report. They're an organization that we're going to reach out to as we kind of go through the strategy. We're going to work also very closely with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, Commissioner Tamley. But we have specifically not allocated that $10.5 million because we want to make sure we have the right stakeholders at the table to make those decisions.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, Ernie, could you, well, first, let me just say thank you in a sense, because following this process for a while, and thank you, Dr. Jackson, in terms of the alignment by the budget with the vision and the financial stability that goes along with it. Just want to commend you all and staff of CPS on that. And but could you also talk about the next steps in terms of the assessment of the school buildings?
And that's actually a good point, because I did want to follow up with that relative to a question that Lucino had, is, we are required by state law to do biannual assessments of all of our facilities. And up until 2015, the way the district did that was best practice. You contract out with a third-party company that does a comprehensive assessment of all your facilities. In 2017, our capital plan was, I think, roughly $106 million. Those assessments cost around $5 million. And the decision was made that we would do those assessments internally. There was a lot of criticism. I could also understand not wanting to devote $5 million out of a $100 million plan. In last year's capital plan, we did put together an RFP as well as funding to include assessments in there. It's a $5 million line item, which the process is ongoing. But as part of that RFP requirement, not only will the company have to put a school by school comprehensive 70-page assessment as on our website, but they also have to be able to aggregate information in a much more public facing way. So to answer, board member Sotelo's question, when you have a situation where a school says, why did that school get, a new roof and I didn't? While we would never print a list of 1 to 500 just because conditions change during the course of the year that require a school to go up or down. When an assessment is done, there is a prioritization of certain tiers.
Sure.
So one of the things that we want to be able to do as part of our long-term capital planning, when these assessments are done, and they should be done by next year, is being able to have public information that shows where tiers are. So as we tackle a 5-year capital plan, we should be able to sit there and say, you know what, we want to try to get to all the roofs in tiers 1 and 2 across the next 5 years. I'm making that up.
Mhm.
But it will provide a much greater level of visibility to people and saying, well, I'm in tier 3. I guess my roof is not as bad as anyone else, as other folks. And it's not to say that they don't have an issue, but at least they'll have an understanding of where they stand relative to the prioritization of that.
Yeah, and lastly, the board member, Reverend Lurie, pointed out that a pretty good idea. Was thinking of stealing it from him, but yeah. but just trying to create a process where that the budgeting process can be participatory.
Yep.
That people can, in addition to the assessments, because they're there every day, that that they can also be able to weigh in. During the budget process for both capital and operating. Well, operating is kind of with the RFP. That's a cool deal. But yeah, just create that opportunity, for schools and parents and stakeholders to be able to, participate that way.
Yeah. And, one thing, when we released our initial EFMP in 2013, we created a number of community hearings specifically around the EFMP, and we got criticism saying, hey, we already have state and CAC meetings and other community-based organization meetings that CPS can leverage. So that's what we did last year. And then we got criticism saying that's great, but you need to find a balance to be able to make sure that you're using existing vehicles for community engagement, but also carving out opportunities to specifically talk about capital and
all community
planning as a whole.
All communities, they don't have a CAC, for instance, or so it's just that to be fair from north to south, to make sure that the education stakeholders, as well as those parents and family, have an opportunity to participate in the process, and that it's something that we, advertise and let them know that, hey, we like to get an idea of what's going on in your school and making sure that you're not being left out.
Absolutely.
Sort of building on that a bit in terms of the transparency side of things. Well, first, just to go back a moment, I just want to also say thank you for the focus on deferred maintenance this year. I mean, I think for so many years, you see over and over these new projects, and some of them, we looked at the heat map that was shown where they've been located.
Sure.
And so I think it's a big deal to actually address the deferred maintenance, a lot of investments at neighborhood schools in this capital plan. But similar to Board Member Truss, I think the need for transparency also needs to be around the equity analysis. So it's one thing to say a hardship index is used, and I know that the Office of Equity is working at putting together some more processes and tools, but I think the more that we can, when they exist, share them
Absolutely.
with the public, have either a participatory process or whatever this engagement is going to look like around both the capital plan and the budget plan, that brings that level of analysis and allows people to actually engage in it.
I completely agree.
Yeah, important.
I'm good. I'm just feeding a fed horse at this point because the points have already been lifted up around the transparency, and you gave some nice examples, Arnie, too, of like the level of transparency that you want to be able to provide. And I think also just underscoring the participation.
Absolutely.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments regarding the capital budget, we can proceed.
All right. Thank you, Arnie.
Thanks, Arnie.